Hi, everyone. So, this is the 21st episode. So, I'm pretty happy with that and really happy with the engagement. I'm really excited about what's coming, just continuing to talk with people and share these stories, so that we can keep this community growing. If you enjoy the podcast and think you know someone else who might enjoy it, please let them know. Leaving reviews on iTunes or other platforms is really helpful to spread the word. Okay, here's the show. What I love the most is discovering things in our world that don't make sense and yet not only exist, but have existed for a very long time. And within baseball, one fantastic example is statistics. Now, this is nothing new, and a lot of you are going to be familiar with what I'm talking about. Michael Lewis wrote about this in his book Moneyball, which was turned into a film starring Brad Pitt. And before Lewis, there was the father of statistics, Bill James, and his statistical approach to baseball he dubbed sabermetrics. There's a lot of great information out there, but one source that really added a lot to the conversation, at least for me, was a book called Smart Baseball by Keith Law. And I said, I've been buying more books recently. Keith Law's book is available through Kindle Unlimited, meaning it's free. But I liked the book so much, I actually bought it too. And as I really dove into the book and other sources and articles, I found so much good stuff. I decided to do a multi-part series. These upcoming episodes are about statistics and terms in baseball that either don't make sense, period, or don't make sense and cause a lot of problems, like batting average or RBIs, runs batted in, or wins. So part of what I'm going to cover is the specific stats and what's wrong with them. But I'm just as fascinated about the denial. And this topic is a great case study in why we deny reality and truth. Part of the answer is realizing that to accept reality, you have to accept change, and most people don't want to. I'm facing that dilemma right now because using stats in my episodes is an easy shortcut. When I reference a ball player from a year ago or 90 years ago, I can tell you their batting average and total season RBIs, and you get an idea of how good they were. At least you think you do. And I'll probably still reference these stats, but they don't hold the weight they used to for me and for many people. I consider myself fairly knowledgeable about baseball and the rules and different statistics. And when I read Keith Law's book and dove into this topic, I had no trouble agreeing. But why didn't I see it? Part of the answer is that it made enough sense. I didn't feel the need to dig, to question batting average or RBIs. But I'm on the outside. For people in the game, they must have been aware of the problem since the beginning. 100 years is a long time to stick your head in the sand. But we're talking about tradition. And this gets us to the next reason people ignore reality and truth. Core beliefs. If you've read Moneyball by Michael Lewis or seen the movie, you remember those old men around that long rectangular table, the scouts and advisors to Billy Beane. They've been in the game for decades, for some probably 50 or 60 years. They have institutional knowledge. They have experience, and in their minds, they have a lot to offer. So what happens when Billy Beane tells them he's going to do things differently when it comes to assessing and hiring new players? And he doesn't care about their thoughts, their opinions, their experience, their expertise. Suddenly, these men have no purpose, no value, no identity, no livelihood. And to tell them they have no value, that's really suicide-inducing language. It is. To present them with this reality about statistics and what it means to actually assess the value of a ball player Billy Beane was offering them one of two options: accept reality and the agonizing pain that comes with the gut punch of no longer being useful, or deny, deny, deny. Wrap yourself in the warm blanket of fantasy and refuse to believe Billy Beane's reality, Bill James's reality. So that's one reason this change is so slow in the making. But there's something else going on here from the fan's perspective. For any lover of baseball, baseball history, baseball nostalgia. When we don't minimize, we see that statistics matter a great deal. Some might say, oh, they're just stats, they're just numbers. But these numbers represent so much. They connect us to players, and to the past, and to the moments and memories from the past. When I tell you that Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs in 1927, or remind you of Lou Gehrig's 2,130 consecutive games played, you get a certain picture in your mind, a certain association. Or when I tell you about Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak in 1941. And what if I add that the day after DiMaggio's hitting streak ended, he started a new 16-game hitting streak. And also, before Pro Bowl, DiMaggio hit in 61 straight games for the Pacific Coast League. Again, with these stats, you create a picture in your mind of the man and his feats, and you're reminded also of what you already knew. Idols can become like friends, and these stats are cues to tune us back in. When I was a kid, my favorite player was Wade Boggs, third baseman for the Boston Red Sox. I also collected baseball cards, so stats were huge for me, and Wade Boggs was all about batting average, always knocking that ball high off the green monster for another base hit. Statistics were comforting for me, and when I watched games or went to games, it was a way to connect with the players. It's nostalgic and emotional, and if suddenly you learn that some of these stats aren't important or meaningful, it's like your parents telling you Santa Claus doesn't exist. It's a hard pill to swallow. For me, the spoonful of sugar is the detail in the arguments. When I get to read something that Keith Law or another journalist wrote and go, wow, that's fascinating. I never saw it that way. For many of you, these truths will not be revelations, but for others, it may be hard medicine to swallow. So I hope you enjoy the spoonfuls of sugar as much as I did. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball, where there are no loud noises, no jarring music, only nostalgic, thought-provoking, emotional stories about baseball. I'm Ben Orlando. The first old friend we're going to say goodbye to is batting average. Well, maybe not goodbye, but I'm not going to visit you quite so often. How much does batting average mean to us? Every year, a player is crowned the batting champion based on his batting average. And speaking of crowns, batting average is part of the big three, the Triple Crown, along with RBIs and home runs. The last time the Triple Crown was won was by Miguel Cabrera in 2012. And before that, Carl Yastrzemski 45 years earlier in 1967. There's also the mythical and elusive quest to hit above 400, which was last done in 1941, 83 years ago by Ted Williams. Even as batting average continues to lose its bona fides, if someone were seriously chasing 400, you'd hear about it. And for those of you who think this point has been settled, that people no longer care about batting average, there's a USA Today article from 2022 with the title, "How Bad Is It for MLB Hitters? Baseball Has Its Worst Batting Average in History." Article titles are how you draw readers in. If batting average didn't matter to people anymore, the journalist wouldn't have chosen that title. Also, in 2018, Major League players were surveyed and voted on the statistics they liked the most or found the most meaningful. And some players still chose batting average. So, what's wrong with batting average as a measure of a man's skill? Well, it doesn't give you a full, accurate measure of a player's skill. Or, as journalist Paul Fulcomer put it, quote, using batting average to describe a hitter's talent is like introducing yourself to someone by naming your favorite pizza topping, end quote. First, what is batting average? It's pretty simple, kind of. Batting average is calculated by dividing a player's hits by his number of at-bats. So, batting average should tell us, according to writer John Foley, quote, how often a player gets a hit when he comes to the plate. Except that at-bats is not the measure of how many times a player comes to the plate, end quote. Because in batting average calculation, you don't count at-bats that include walks, hit by pitches, sacrifices, and a catcher's interference. But as Foley explained, quote, when you compile those outcomes together over the course of a season, you could easily end up with 50 or 100 or even more times batting that are not counted in the batting average, end quote. Keith Law pointed out a good example to this problem with Barry Bonds. In 2002 and 2004, because Bonds walked so much, he, quote, became the only player in history whose plate appearances were more than 50% higher than his at-bats, end quote. Now, why is this the case? Well, we know the story with walks. According to author Richard Hirschberger, quote, in 1876, a base on ball was charged against a batter's average. Then 11 years later, in 1887, it is credited to the average. These anomalies were the manifestation of a decades-long discussion on how to think about the base on balls. This discussion only affected averages in those 2 years, but continued beneath the surface in the intervening years, finally arriving at the modern conclusion in 1888, end quote. So as a compromise, walks were not counted for or against a player's average. It was like they didn't exist. Except in the reality of baseball, walks are very important and can help a team significantly, and walks are counted in on-base percentage. A player can have a 300 batting average, but also get on base 33% of the time, whereas another player can have a 260 batting average, but because he gets a lot of walks, his on-base percentage might be 360. One player probably looks better to fans. He's a little more exciting. But which player is more valuable to the team and creates more opportunities to score runs? Another problem that Keith Law and others point out, back to that pizza analogy, is that batting average doesn't tell us what kind of hits the player's getting. For batting average, a single, double, triple, and home run are all dumped into the same pot. For the statistic on total bases, you have to go to slugging percentage. And for on-base percentage plus slugging percentage, you have OPS, which is a very popular stat today. A player can hit a ton of singles and not be nearly as valuable as a player who hits fewer but more impactful doubles and home runs. Once we have this information, it might seem clear why batting average is less valuable than, say, slugging percentage, which counts for total bases. And this begs the question, if this is the case, why was batting average elevated over slugging percentage? The answer actually makes sense when we look at the history. According to baseball historian John Thorne, it was all because of Henry Chadwick, known as the father of baseball for his numerous contributions to the game. Originally, Chadwick had used slugging percentage, or total bases, to measure value. What Thorne found in his research was that Chadwick was accounting for a major problem in the game, which was poor fielding. Because a hit could easily turn into a double or triple, Chadwick thought it highly inaccurate to award players all these extra bases when many were coming from poor fielding, and you couldn't really tell if it should have been a single or a double or a triple. So he decided the best thing to do was simply count each hit as a hit. So you no longer had to worry if it was a double or triple or in the park home run. But then when fielders improved, as well as the ability to distinguish between an earned single or double, baseball did not update its reliance on batting average. And as Keith Law pointed out, there were significant costs to this reliance. One example was the MVP award in 1991. According to Law, Barry Bonds, quote, led the NL in on-base percentage, ranked fourth in slugging, and even finished second in runs batted in. But Bonds lost the award to Atlanta's Terry Pendleton, whose primary achievement that year was leading the league in batting average at .319, end quote. Also, in deciding who gets into Cooperstown, batting average has always been a major factor. In his book, Law noted the references to batting average on many Hall of Fame plaques. According to Law, quote, we revere the lifetime 300 hitter as if he's ascended to a higher plane of existence than the mere 299 hitter. But the batting title and the stat behind it are both guilty of telling us half-truths, giving us a less than complete story of the hitter's performance, end quote. In my research, I came across one more interesting angle when it comes to batting average, and the point was made by none other than the father of sabermetrics, Bill James. In an article titled Reliable and Unreliable Batting Average, James voiced an issue with what he sometimes saw as unreliable averages. What James meant was that sometimes we see a batting average and we think, oh, that guy's a great hitter. But he may only have a handful of at-bats. You see this at the beginning of the baseball season. For days and weeks, a hitter will have 600, 700, even 800 batting average, and it takes time for that to level out. There are so many factors involved, and as writer John Edwards explained, quote, if you're hitting screaming line drives directly at fielders, you're getting unlucky, end quote. So Bill James, using statistics and simulations, wanted to find out how many at-bats it would take to account for all these different factors, to really level things out and get a clear picture of what a batter's true ability is. His results are pretty surprising, because after 550 at-bats, which is a player playing just about every game of one full season, his reliability is only 53% of indicating where he should be. So again, if his batting average after a full season is 300, that's still off of where he should be when you eliminate all the other factors. And if we look at 1,500 at-bats or 3 seasons, he's closer at 70%. So James pointed out that it's really hard to assess a player's skill over a short period of time while considering all the outside factors. If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. Okay, it's time for our next intervention. I've invited Mr. RBI to the house. He doesn't really know why he's here, but he's surrounded by friends. You've had a good run, RBI, no pun intended. You've represented one of the key statistics in baseball for more than a century. You make up one of the pillars of the Triple Crown. You seem sturdy and strong and dependable. After all, run output is hugely important to a team's success. But we all want to be honest here. There are some serious flaws in your stat. In his book, Smart Baseball, Keith Law went all the way back to 1954 to find a quote by Branch Rickey regarding the value of RBIs. And just as a side note, I know I just said RBIs with an S. even though RBI is short for runs batted in. So it would be runs batted ins, but actually RBI and RBIs are both acceptable for the plural. Anyway, Branch Rickey was a legendary, larger-than-life general manager for the St. Louis Cardinals, Brooklyn Dodgers, and Pittsburgh Pirates. Rickey thought outside of the box and looked ahead. It was Rickey who signed Jackie Robinson in 1947, the first black player in the major leagues since 1887. And when he was with the Pirates, Rickey was instrumental in adopting batting helmets, working with scientists to design several prototypes. And in a Life magazine article in 1954, Rickey said this about RBIs. Quote, "As a statistic, RBIs were not only misleading, but dishonest. They depended on managerial control, a hitter's position in the batting order, park dimensions, and the success of his teammates in getting on base ahead of him." End quote. And from Law, quote, "The RBI stat is responsible for more bad postseason award decisions than any other single factor in baseball history." End quote. More specifically, according to journalist Zachary Reimer, quote, "The MVP award has tended to go to RBI men, and many of the players on baseball's all-time RBI list have been elected to the Hall of Fame, including 12 of the top 15 players on the list." End quote. Reimer's article is from 2012, so since then, some others in this category have been added to the Hall, like Ken Griffey Jr. Now, Reimer and Law aren't saying that these players are bad players, not at all. Simply that this one stat, the RBI, often stands out as the hallmark of a great player. And players with better overall seasons are often overlooked for the Hall of Fame, for MVP voting, like Mike Trout, who lost twice to players with more RBIs. Don Malcolm, writing in the Hardball Times, did a calculation of the percentage of MVP award winners who led the league in RBIs since the award's inception in 1931. From 1931 to 1955, 32% of winners led the league in RBIs. From 1956 to 1989, 46% led the league in RBIs. But from 1990 to 2008, as the baseball world began to catch on to the RBI shortcomings, only 21% led the league. And when we translate this to contracts and money, the RBI has been responsible for GMs and owners deciding whether or not to hire a player, and often choosing the player with a lot of RBIs. That's billions of dollars trading hands thanks to the myth of the RBI. In his Bleacher Report article, Reimer reiterated some of Branch Rickey's points when he wrote, quote, "The RBI is, in essence, a team-oriented stat. To gather a lot of RBI, a hitter has to come to the plate with runners on base consistently. And that's something that's dependent on A, his spot in the lineup, and B, the hitters who hit ahead of him." End quote. For another good example, we have, again, Barry Bonds. As Keith Law wrote, quote, "Bonds holds the dubious distinction of being one of only 2 hitters in MLB history to qualify for the batting average title and drive himself in more than he drove in his teammates." End quote. Let's take a moment to parse this out, because to me this is really interesting. In 2001, when Bonds shattered the single-season home run record with 73, his RBI total was only 137. He drove himself home 73 times, but drove his teammates home only 64 times. And it's not like he wasn't hitting the ball. Bonds managed 156 hits that season, but the bases were empty 54% of the times he came to the plate. As Law explained, quote, "The season that is number 1 on the home run list doesn't crack the all-time 120 for RBI in a single year." End quote. So just think about that. Bonds shattered the home run record with 73 home runs. And yet 120 people are above him on the list of season RBIs. As a comparison, Law brought up the case of Joe Carter in 1990, who hit .232 with a .290 on-base percentage. Both of these stats were at the bottom of the league. And yet, Carter, at age 37, finished third in the league in RBIs with 115. Comparison, Joe Carter, batting .232, on-base percentage .290, hit 115 RBIs. Barry Bonds, batting .328 with a .515 on-base percentage, had only 137 RBIs. And let's repeat that. He had a .515 on-base percentage. Bonds reached base safely more than half the time. Also, he hit 73 home runs that year compared to Carter's 24. So what happened? Well, Carter had 542 base runners on board when he came to the plate. And he also led the league in plate appearances with 697. According to Law, this would be the most base runners Carter ever had in a single season of his career. And it also mattered who was in front of him. So who was in front of Carter? Roberto Alomar, Tony Gwynn, and Jack Clark. Two of these three men are Hall of Famers. And Jack Clark typically had a high on-base percentage, leading the league in 1987. So the RBI is really a team effort, with one man getting all the glory. Now, if we use this same pattern for the 2024 season, we see one team and a few players who are going to have a really good shot at getting a lot of RBIs. And I'm talking about the Los Angeles Dodgers, specifically Will Smith and Max Muncy, who typically are batting fourth and fifth in the lineup, because hitting in front of them are Mookie Betts, Shohei Ohtani, and Freddie Freeman. Now, the only downside for Smith and Muncy is that from an RBI perspective, Betts, Ohtani, and Freeman, in addition to getting on base a lot, also hit a lot of home runs, which of course nullifies the chance for other people to get RBIs. But before we give Mr. RBI a good hug and send him on his way, there's one more point to bring up, and it's a contentious one. I'm talking about the idea or myth of the clutch hitter, which is often linked with the RBI. If a player has a lot of RBI, he drives in a lot of runs, which causes us to assume that he's a clutch hitter. When there are men on base and the game on the line, he delivers. According to many analysts and journalists, this just isn't true. From Keith Law, quote, "There is such a thing as clutch hits, but not clutch hitters. If you look at the numbers and try to find that hitter, you'll find that he doesn't exist," end quote. To prove whether or not there was such a thing as a clutch hitter, Dick Kramer put together research and analysis from the 1969 and 1970 season, and he published his findings in the Baseball Research Journal. Kramer found that players who had clutch performances in 1969 reverted to normal performances the following season. In 2008, Phil Birnbaum published similar findings in the same journal, choosing the 1974 and 1975 season. The point these analysts and journalists were trying to make was that ball players were basically always clutch players. At such a high level, the pressure is always on. And again from Law, quote, "A good clutch hitter is just a good hitter. If you can hit with men on base, with 2 strikes, with 2 outs, with runners in scoring position, with the score tied, whatever the case may be," end quote. So it seems like there's a consensus, but among ball players, there is definitely not. In a Sports Illustrated article from 2004, various players took offense to the notion that clutch players didn't exist. When presented with these statistical findings, Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson replied, quote, "That could be the absolute dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life," end quote. And from Hall of Fame shortstop Derek Jeter, quote, "You can take those stat guys and throw them out the window," end quote. The impasse here is head versus heart, how you feel during the game or watching players during the game versus what the numbers say. And we can go back to Moneyball and these men around the table, how they feel versus what the numbers say, hard truths, and what it takes for you to accept that. But outside of this argument, there seems to be no argument that the RBI really represents a team effort. So how can you fairly divvy up credit? One answer is linear weighting. According to law, quote, with linear weighting, any event from a hitter is worth, on average, some fraction of a run. So if you assign the right fractional amount of a run to each of those events and add them up, you'll get a number that measures in runs the value of all that hitter's actual production for a given time period. End quote. And, today with technology, they can actually divvy it up. They can break it up into fractional amounts. But when it comes down to it, Law wrote, it's about what a player actually did during his time on the field and what these stats can tell us about how the player will perform in the future. And when we look at the RBI alone, it by itself is not a great predictor of future performance. So what is a great predictor? Many of you already know the answer here. The first is on-base percentage. How often you get on base. It's simple, but that's considering everything. It's considering hitting and walks. The second is slugging percentage, which is the total bases calculation. And the third is on-base plus slugging, or OBP. There's also another stat, which is not really a stat, but a construct, a compilation of stats. And that's WAR, W-A-R, which stands for wins above replacement, which is a bit hard to explain, but I'll do so in the next episode. So with a bit more information, we can still appreciate what these stats have done for us, have meant for us, but also in reality, understand what they're actually doing in their function. That's all for tonight. The music is A Long Way by Sergei Pavkin at Pixabay. Good night.